we're in one of the great buildings in Philadelphia on our campus and potentially in the United States. So the library building by Frank Furness is, late 1880s. He's, someone who, as an architect, didn't have any interest in traveling to Europe. He didn't want to go see the, sites of antiquity, the early Renaissance. That's the next generation is into that. So he's someone who's very connected with the engineers that are making things, building things, corporations, railroads, connections, infrastructure. And the idea that architecture, can be responsive to changing times in a very animated way animates his architecture. And so the library building is an inspiration in part because it is so grounded in the thinking about what libraries do, how it's done, the spaces that are required, the potential for growth in terms of books and understanding, just the mechanisms that were making books much cheaper, much more easy. It was easier to put information into books to compile it and then to build great libraries. So this idea of expandable stacks. So from a kind of functional point of view, it's very thoughtfully put together, and the kind of a regularity of the building stems from that. Many people have compared this to a machine, the Furness Library to a machine, where every part is contributing and nothing is extraneous, nothing is decorated, or superfluous rather. And then on the other hand, you get these amazing details where columns do not follow any of the prescriptions from the Greeks. They are squat like like you've caught a piston in the middle of its cycle. The colors in some ways are outrageous, or at the very least strong and bold. But it's communicating something. This building, is not turning to classicism to say this is a special place. It's built like a bastion. It's got a more, its spirit draws from other sources. And that's part of what makes Frank Furness kind of one of the most original architects of his generation. Someone who's a little bit younger than Furness, but is perhaps better known, is Richardson, H.H. Richardson. And he's someone who does go to Europe. He does go to Paris and studies in Paris. His buildings do have, for sure, an originality and a strength and a just a sense of repose. Furness is not interested in those same things, and his buildings stand in contrast for that. But he was not an iconoclast that was kind of, out there and kind of a weirdo that or a maverick. He had lots of clients, and those clients were engineers, and they understood this. He spoke a language, a form that responded to the thinking of the day. So the buildings are very strong for that. So your original question is like, does this building, that houses the archive, what does it give? And my answer, I think, was like, it gives us everything. The point of having an archive like this, in my mind, and I think this has always been what drives what we do, because we're part of a school, of design, people have to sit down and take some invisible notion in your mind. And always things look better when you squint your eyes and you imagine it. When you open your eyes, things start to fall apart. So you have to apply creativity in order to make this stuff work. So having a building where we go to every day for our work, our researchers and the scholars that use the collection, the students that use the collection, come into a building that does something. It says something. It energizes. You don't always know that it's going on, but when you've seen enough great buildings, and you've seen enough buildings that are so, that there's things that at play.
And Do you have any of Furness's work in the archive?
Oh, of course. I mean, there's not a centralized archive in the sense that, the Louis Kahn collection here, kind of preserves, the vast majority of materials that came out of his office. Furness's office, he was out, tastes had changed. The people who were hiring architects for great projects were interested in those architects who had more of a sense of subtlety and taste, an interest in antiquity and in subtlety of tradition. And that's all interesting and fine, but it just that Furness had less to do, and was not getting the same project. So, the kind of myth is that when the office closed down, they just threw everything down the elevator shaft, and that was that. There was not an archive saved from the office side. So everything that survives has survived through the hands of the clients. And so there's materials here. And in fact, there's somebody in the reading room right now looking at the set of drawings we have from May, I think, of 1888, that are the kind of the drawings that were presented to the university by the architects. And these are, the sheets that were probably used to build the building. And what's remarkable about those sets of drawings is that, nowadays you guys just press print and all the sheets are the same size. Back then they could reproduce a drawing, but it was more labor intensive. But they had not standardized sets of drawings. So every sheet is a different size.
Wow.
In order to indicate one material choice over another and how they come together. You're not using a set of graphic standards, you're actually watercoloring. So blue is for a certain type of stone and reds are for brick or terracotta. Yellows and shades of yellows could be for different kinds of woods and so on. And there's even a bit of metal being shown there. So they're a very different kind of set of drawings. And then, the railroads, and Furness did a lot of work for the various railroads, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the Reading Railroad. So he worked for some of the great railroads that were on the Monopoly game board, doing stations and so on. A lot of the drawings that survived for Furness came out of those companies. And we have to thank those individuals that are into trains, the people who follow trains and follow the engineering, and just there's a romance and a nostalgia for train travel and all the things that go with it. So when the Reading Railroad was closing down, for example, basically they started throwing away this archive that was 100+ years old. And there were people on the other side of the dumpster pulling things out. And they included drawings. Not a huge amount, but enough to kind of show you what that world looked like. Maybe the most personal group of records that survive is Furness was very avid in carrying a sketchbook around. And he was quite animated in what he drew in the sketchbooks. And he's quite funny and almost bizarre in that he's drawing caricatures of people and he's making fun of them and himself. But he's distorting forms. He's twisting and racking what he's drawing, to humorous effect, to satirical effect. But clearly that shaping of things is something that one can imagine has, or I think has a resonance in the buildings. They're kind of monsters or beasts in a way. And I think that's very intentional on his part.
I mean, that's maybe what resonates with Turner Brooks as well, the humor in maybe Furness's approach. But so what's interesting in it there, I guess most of the archive is archive of buildings that are not there, that are not above you, that you're not sitting within. And I guess with that example is you're capturing something about that very space that you're in. And perhaps that requires a different kind of relationship to that material. Do you ever think of that?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question, and you can take it apart in a few ways. One, in a very basic way, you are asking questions about collecting policy and the mission of what you collect, and what are the resources that you seek out because you see a use in them, right?
Mhm.
So, to answer that question is, we collect in depth out of the working offices of architects, landscape architects, some planners. And by collecting in depth, you're able to follow the thinking process. You're able to inhabit that, to enter it years later, and to engage with those materials that are left behind for things other than building. In terms of stimulating the development of thinking skills amongst students, is one of them. A second facet of what you're talking about has to relate with the scope of your collecting. Like, do you go back to the 16th century? Are you collecting only the built environment of the city that you're in? So again, there's plenty of places, historical societies, national museums, that sort of thing, where their focus is on a particular region, culture, some set of coordinates, if you will. And a lot of the archives that were established in the 70s here in America, or early 80s, and we are counted among that, there was kind of a sense that you stuck to a region, and there's a lot of good reasons for that, right? These are things that support understanding that could be directed towards heritage conservation, towards people upkeeping interesting buildings in the area. It's also just frankly can be expensive to move a big archive from one place to another, let alone across an ocean. Not that we haven't done that every once in a while, but by and large, our commitment is to this general region of Pennsylvania. And, but we are not the archive that holds the resources for the University of Pennsylvania. We're not the archive that holds the resources for the school, although we definitely have strong holdings for both. I would say we're kind of, gathering and collecting a community of individuals who engaged in really interesting and remarkable ways at certain moments in time, and that their conversation, happened in the school, happened in the juries, but they were architects who were working, all over the place and all over the world. Occasionally, we brought collections over from more distant lands. An example is Anant Rajay, an architect in India, but he worked very closely with Louis Kahn. He came to Philadelphia. He worked in Kahn's office for 5 or 6 years. He was entrusted with, being kind of the on-site person for the Indian Institute of Management, and the structure of that commission was different than any other job in Kahn's office, meaning the kind of the office where the construction drawings were made was in India. It was not here, and he traveled quite a bit. So Rajay was in a unique position of having worked closely and well in Philadelphia, not on the India project. He worked on the Exeter Library and on other buildings. So he knew Kahn's impulses, and he understood the way in which one would move a set of considerations forward, maybe not too fast, maybe holding back on certain things, as the design developed. So, there's a few things like that that have come in, but by and large, it's stuff in Philadelphia. So, you've got the idea that there's collecting missions and collecting policies about why you might limit yourself, or in other words, give direction for certain things. And then lastly, there is a tradition of holding drawings in special buildings. The model used to build, St. Peter's, done by Michelangelo. There's actually a room in St. Peter's which holds that model. and there's other instances where the archive is embedded within the building itself as a kind of hidden key that can be tapped into every once in a while to help with understanding, to help with stewardship, to engage with teaching and things like that. So, but being in a great building, being in a city that's got a lot of great architecture, using the connection between the resources that are held in this collection and, doing, to put it very simply, public programs of all sorts that allow people opportunities in a scholarly way, in a recreational way, in just a simple educational way through things like tours, ways of connecting with the knowledge, the information, the heritage that's preserved in the archive that speaks to places out there in the world, and maybe is a way to help people think about what makes a place good, what makes it satisfying, and then that extra dimension when, which is more rare, when something's really good. What are those things? And often people know that it's there. They're not architects. They can't quite put their finger on it, but maybe the great architects also really can't quite put their finger on it. One of the things I think about with Louis Kahn, that in thinking about monumental expression, there's no formula for it. He expresses it that there's just no way to really know what's going to make it click, so much as it is the kind of the way of being thoughtful in your engagement with it and allowing a sense of character to emerge in how you develop your ideas, how you go about exploring it. So, having a good building, having one of the best buildings, if not the best building on campus, be the home for this place, I think is very special. It also happens to be in the heart of the campus. So we were talking a few moments ago just about the idea, is my office in the center of things? No, but this building is, to the east is where the engineering campus is, or the engineering school's physical plant where their buildings are. In the opposite direction is the humanities, and farther off is business, the social sciences. So architecture and our buildings are kind of right in the middle of all that. The law school is a little bit to the north, and we've got the college green just on one side of the building. So, it's nice to be in the heart of things, both intellectually, but also just physically. It's a place where there's a lot of people crossing in front of our building, by our building. So they know it, and they maybe recognize that there's something interesting here before ever really, if they ever, having a chance to see what goes on in here.
I wonder what I really like in your explanation, or in the way that you paint a picture of a archive is that there is a conversation, or there are many conversations that are happening within the archive, I guess, between the material. Like, material is almost talking to each other. And I don't know whether you ever feel like material is in conversation with itself. And so I presume that there are, hundreds, if not thousands, of conversations that are there. They just need to be unpicked. But I wonder if there is one conversation, like is there a central conversation in this archive that you have such a strong sense of?
What makes things good? I mean, I think ultimately the reason for being of this archive is engaging with ways in which thoughtful people went about figuring out the difference between something that's good and something that's really good, right? Because, that's what you're after, right? And that's not easy to figure out. And there's so many variables that go in to achieving a result that has some lasting value and engagement that elevates things, right? And so the idea that the stuff talks, it's that it is part of that process, and taking the time to look at, to engage with, to think about the objects that are here, and to start using them to tell stories that, can be about the moment that they were created. They can also be about, well, here's somebody using a certain tool, a certain technique, a certain way of drawing, a certain view. And here's somebody else from a different collection, a different time period, doing the exact same thing or doing something just a little bit different. And, that's also another way of reflecting, perhaps in slightly more abstract ways, about thinking. So you have the thinking that's invested in the object as part of the continuity of making a thing, of a specific commission. And then you have a broader perspective on the tools of design, the drawings that are chosen, modeling techniques, and how those change and don't change over time. And because there's lots of little decisions that are evident in those materials. And again, maybe that's one thing that in the programming that we do with students in particular, reflecting on those little decisions is interesting, because it's different by and large than the topics that are discussed in school, in studio, in history theory classes. And those lessons are important, and perhaps more so. But the little decisions are the things that, can be helpful in unlocking the individual talent, the individual skill, the individual's sense of insight. So the objects talking to each other, there are infinite conversations, because of the possibilities of juxtaposing what Louis Kahn was doing with what Denise Scott Brown was doing, or what Robert Adam was doing, or Charles Rennie McIntosh, around ideas that are very basic in architecture. Like how does one go about taking notes on site? When you go out into the world, how do you start to organize information, data, emotional connections, what have you, as a way of starting a project. So, those are the kind of possibilities I think are what bring an archive like this to life, and make it a spirited place, because you're thinking, and I think we align our thinking along, here's some students, they maybe don't know what they're doing. There's also architects that I think are humble. They may be world famous, but they're humble in the sense that they don't know what they're doing. So they have to do things. They have to be more creative. They have to do some stuff. And that the material that's stored and kept and cared for in a place like this has a context in the future, and engaging those people who are active today and will be active in the future with certain questions about what makes architecture, architecture, what makes something have a positive contribution in the lives of people who don't necessarily think on a daily basis about those values of architecture or landscape.
I guess a very important lesson for my students when we came to visit you was to acknowledge and understand design process, that it's a journey, that it takes time, that ideas really evolve and develop. I mean, that's one thing that educators often struggle with I guess you have a year in academia to develop a project, usually in architectural education, or less, I think in America.
Or 6 weeks.
6 weeks or a week, and this reluctance to sometimes iterate, and this reluctance to or actually it's quite hard to teach this. It's quite hard to tell students and to show students that this is what a piece of architecture requires, is a kind of journey. And what was interesting in the material that you brought in front of us was that you showed us that the initial drawing of Louis Kahn's for the Four Freedoms Park, and the kind of the difference between that and what we see in reality is the gap is quite wide. And I think for the students, it was a real direct learning experience, and it's a very direct clue that this is a journey, that to acknowledge that it is a process, or to trust the process, something we always ask them to do. But so I guess that's another purpose of the archive.
Well, I mean, by collecting in depth, you have steps along that journey, to use your way of characterizing, and that's a perfectly good way of characterizing it. But there's also lots of these moments where you see choosing or not choosing, stalling, drawing things out, delaying, being confused, seeing drawings where they don't come together as a drawing, because the ideas aren't there, but then they put it aside and they start again, right? That's just wildly fascinating to me. And I think it's one of the things that in my time in the archives, and I've been here almost 32 years now, I was a student when I first came here, and I felt like, I loved architecture. I loved the action, the what you would do in studio, and trying to take an idea and express it in form, and what generates those shapes. So I lost my train of thought, but that action is important.
In a way, now you're reminding me that you actually mentioned already this very important aspect of decision making that you can trace or track or see as you look through the material.
Right.
When you study architecture, you either encounter a building, which is a finished project in some way. Of course, we could argue it's never finished, but you see it finished, or you see drawings of it. But seeing that evolution of idea and this abandonment of ideas and development of other ideas, it's something that I think it's really, you can only discover in a place where you have that material in front of you.
I mean, that's the value. I mean, that's the value of collecting in depth, and and to see change, and to see the decision points, as simple as just putting down one pencil and picking up a different type of pencil. Those are all moments where you can reflect and bring students to reflect on someone's reflections. And, just because they're wanting to see things from a different vantage point, they want to consider things by using a different set of tools, making a different kind of drawing. All of those things are just ways of prompting the students to look inward on the thinking and their thinking, which is really about seeing. It's really about how they are facilitating in their own mind mechanisms for clarifying things. It's also interesting, like sometimes people need to slow, they create and make choices to slow themselves down, to obfuscate for a while, to make it so that they don't go to the thing that they always go to. This kind of way of being facile about certain things that make you move too quickly to a solution. And so things that create friction and create a certain sort of impediment, not impediments, but I mean, to developing things.
And I guess the manifestation of that could be that it was item number 1 in the Kahn collection, which is that tiny model.
Well, it just happens to be numbered 1.
Oh, it is, but it is okay.
Yeah, so in that series, so all archives are responsible for organizing and maintaining intellectual control of stuff. And models are particularly, troublesome for a lot of archives because they're all different in sizes. They take up lots of space. And so one can imagine, my forebears here at the archives, cataloging Kahn's models and say, let's start with the smallest one, and figure out what we're doing. So, that's a special little piece that you just realize its value because somebody realized it wasn't the right thing. In that moment in time, it was active, the energy was focused on it, the attention was there, and then it wasn't. And, but they didn't throw it away. They, somehow it got pulled along and it's still with us. And it's one of the objects that I use the most to initiate a conversation with students about what makes this place tick. They may be doing a lot of stuff with digital-based design tools, but there's still a variety of tools. And you don't have to use only one of them. You can also step back and you can use some of the good old drawing and, study models that you make with your own hands rather than having something print it for you, something make it for you. Some of the objects that survive or don't survive, particularly the ones that don't survive, are often have come to us and come to the collection as a piece of oral history. And when a choice was made to do a certain drawing that was, perhaps because of its size, doesn't survive because it was just, somebody said, we have to do this in order to understand this in this moment. But the system of how they stored things just would not accept that, So, the story goes one day, Kahn wanted to understand the size and at full scale of the vaults at the Kimball Art Museum. So the staff got out big pieces of the brown butcher paper, as we call it, laid it out on the floor, moved the desks out of the way first, and drew it. And it was there on the floor for as long as Kahn needed to, stand with it. And then it was rolled up and it disappeared, because it was probably just too big. And when someone looked at it, thinking about, are we going to store this? In the months after he died, they moved the collection. They may have seen this and said, "This, we don't know, and we don't know what this is," and tossed it, right? But it survives because, one of the people who worked for Kahn told me the story about it. And so part of making that facet of the collection useful is telling the stories that come out of that oral history among those gathered around the table looking at drawings. Because these are all these intangible moments that, the idea that you can look in at an object and really know what's going on it's just not possible. You can make certain deductions, and those deductions can be strengthened by historical research and the rigorous kind of academic engagement that scholars champion. And I agree with all that. So often the stories I'm telling are based on looking at a constellation of objects in order to suss out what's interesting about one. And that one is something that would work in the context of a particular class, a particular tour, in order to speak to those things. So, that's what keeps a collection like this alive. I think it's not enough, or it's not creative enough among those people who are responsible for collections like this to say, we're here to support scholarly engagement and to help produce PhDs. That's good. That's important. We want that level of academic engagement. I fully support that. But then there's this whole other tradition of using this for the education of designers. Using collections like this to speak to a broader public audience about the cultural value, the artistic value of what it is that certain very engaged and thoughtful designers accomplish in the space between when something gets commissioned and when they turn the building over to the people who are going to use it every day.
So it sounds like there is a conversation that perhaps pieces are talking to each other. Like the archive, there is a conversation that happens between the material that's there, but of course that conversation is only triggered, or it's only prompted by the conversation or the intention of those people that come into the archive or yourself to look at the work. And I'm really now curious about the conversations that take place around the table, and that so much seems to emerge, so much knowledge and culture seem to emerge from those who come to look at that material. Do you archive that? How do you record that?
Well, I mean, all right, so there's two facets to that. So one, this, we track our statistics based on the academic year. So from July 1st to June 30th. And so this year, I have stood in front of more than 3,000 people, telling them about what it is that, I think about how we engage the collections, and, you guys in your class were counted among that. And, that's, I think that's like 140 discrete events. Mostly it's in the reading room here, but that's also, I'm counting lectures or tours out there in the world, because in a sense, I'm always talking about the same thing. And so that, that's one way of kind of understanding, I'm out there. But what do I get out of that? Often somebody being present in a moment where you're showing someone something and you see it clicks for them, and they then say something that then clicks for you because they're seeing it through their eyes. They're seeing the potential, or you're getting to witness their engagement with the object, which is a precious sort of thing. It's a precious sort of exchange that, doesn't happen all the time, but it happens often enough that you can just see how this stuff can matter to somebody in that individual. So that's a very stimulating thing. So that's part of the conversation. And sometimes someone just in their way of looking at it says something that just like, oh my God, I never thought about it that way, because it's, there's not one way of looking at things. I mean, that's an extension of the conversation analogy that you're describing. It's not just the objects in conversation, it's the gathered group in conversation. And the more questions, the more kind of, slowing down and like what's what the struggle to understand, the more interesting it can get, because you see that sense of awakening to the potential of things that occurs.
I mean, back to you're just making me kind of reflect back to the start of this conversation, which is maybe to do with then looking at buildings. And in fact, I'm really curious about how you perceive real buildings, having known them through that extensive process that you witness in the material that's in front of you. Do you go and visit buildings that you have extensively studied through that process of
Well, I learned that early on in my architectural studies, that the best way to learn about architecture is to go see the buildings and landscapes for yourself. And using the fullness of your humanity, your legs, your sense of smell, all of that, and just walk through that space, because there's all sorts of proportion and the kind of rhythm of proceeding and moving through a landscape is wildly complex. And just noticing in the work of someone like Louis Kahn, where you see a set of drawings, and these are the drawings that are being used for construction, and then you notice that there's all sorts of things on the sheets that were not built as you see them on the sheets, and that that there was part of the process where he's there, and there's a conversation that's happening as the building's being built, and a change is made. You see it in Robert Venturi in certain details, where the prominence of an element was maybe something he missed, and then he drills down into that element you know, with a ferocity of interest, you know, to figure out how to do it right. I'm speaking of, it's the simplest, it's the handrail that takes you up the first run of steps at the mother's house. And how to get that shape right, because it is very prominent when you really think about it. But if you're thinking about it as an architect, you might miss the prominence of it. So it's those, you know, I think the part that I refer students to coming out of my own observation of the places are those moments where you see they don't quite know it all. People like Kahn and Venturi, they're still catching up with the magnitude of their decisions as the building's being built. And that's in their time. We may be in contemporary practice that we're less able to do that sort of improvisation for a whole host of reasons. But I think the problem is still there, you know, about this kind of the experience, because that's where everyone, you know, all the stuff that's here is heading towards that, and putting yourself in that as a thoughtful person, you know, who's interested in learning about what makes these places tick, you know, is entirely worth doing. And going back to places time and again, you know, there's, you know, it's important to see new places, but there's also just the pleasure in going back over a landscape that you've been through, and feeling it and experiencing it that day in that way, as you are in that moment. And you'll see the world in a different way. And so going back time, and, you know, I think the buildings I spend the most time with students are, you know, a few houses by Louis Kahn, the Mother's House by Bob Venturi, and just telling, you know, those gathered, just like, you know, in the winter it's like this, in the summer it's like this, at the end of the day it's like this, the light moves this way, you know, this is, you know, events happened, you know, according to this sort of circumstance, is to bring these spaces to life, based on the experiences I've had. Because, you know, and why I think that's valuable is the most often question, you know, the question most often asked, if the homeowner is there, if the resident is there, is like, what's it like to live there? You know, it's the most basic of questions, and to honor that as something that, when all is said and done, is the most essential thing, is that somebody who is spending their life engaged in a place like this, what does it do for them? And that if they see it as being wonderful, that's what you're trying to do as an architect.
Do you remember going to Franklin D. Roosevelt Memorial for the first time? Because presumably you would have experienced it in drawings long before the building was actually built. So
yeah, I mean, that was a very interesting.
What was that experience?
Yeah, well, that was a special experience, and a very remarkable one, in that up until that point, people coming into the archive were scholars, were curators, were students who had a project, or it was somebody who, but it was just getting started, you know, this, in the sense of, you know, thoughtful people, you know, architects and preservationists dealing with conservation questions of a heritage site. It's more prominent, and I see it a lot more now, because Kahn's buildings, Venturi's buildings, and others are 50, 60, 70 years old now. And so intervention is happening more often. But the pressure of decision-making, of deadlines, of moving a project forward, building momentum, actually getting something built for more than 40 years after the initial designs were put to paper, was an extraordinary thing. And you could sense the consequence of decisions. You could see manifested in what was being proposed, that the archive was a valuable place, because they didn't know certain things, And as a consequence, we're making decisions that reflected, a lack of knowledge and understanding. And so bringing the archives into that conversation, and using the experience I have in looking at things, the networks that I have for talking to people who were there, who were in the drafting room at those times, and knowing who to talk to and the kind of questions to ask to help understand how someone who's being, who's from the outside, who's responsible for stewarding this unbuilt design into the built reality, giving them the kind of information that would be helpful in managing change. Now, it's kind of a radical thing, is that usually as a preservationist, you have,
a
the
thing to
stuff is
preserve.
there, the building
Yeah.
is there. But there's this kind of radical sense is that it's not there, but you want it to be there. And you don't know what you're doing, and you can't, those compromises, Kahn is not there. And you cannot say with any sense of honesty that you would know what Kahn would do. But you could prepare yourself, and you could be thoughtful in looking closely enough to maybe get a sense of the things that he would not have done, or the status of decisions at a certain point in time, and that are suggestive of a certain direction or momentum, but had not been finalized, and maybe something of why that was the case. And so that you could, bring people closer to the thinking in the room. But you maybe not could, you could always find, everyone can find a drawing that says, this confirms my thought. But, your thought doesn't necessarily count in that instance. So no, it was, and then to actually visit the site and to know how the level of pressure that someone like Kahn must have been facing on a day-to-day basis with all the work he did, with his particular way of working, his need to be deliberative and about things, and to explore, not too quickly, and lots of details, not just the overall. All of the stuff that's part of the reason we look at his work, is that it's like everything works. That the sense of stuff being extraneous is really, it's kind of a minimum in his work. It's not to make his work minimal, but it's very spare. And that spareness comes out of an intensity of thought and engagement. So, but the Four Freedoms, actually walking out onto the site and just knowing, that Roosevelt was a president that meant something to Kahn, as a leader of this country, as someone who spoke to the challenges people were facing at a very difficult time that Kahn himself was experiencing, someone who he thought highly of and was honored to have the job, and that, ultimately, part of his vision is there now. It's not all there. I mean, the thing that I know is it's not all there. And that, things that had to be changed for a whole host of reasons and could not have been anticipated, by Kahn, because, the American with Disabilities Act, came in the 90s, long after Kahn's death, and he would have found a way. I mean, he would have found a way,
What we're talking now about are the few steps towards the
yeah, there's lots. I mean, that's the most obvious part,
which have now been blocked with a glass balustrade. Yeah.
No, and there's good reason for that, but it's also, it became a kind of a political contentious thing, and and it could have been handled differently on all sides, I think. But it is what it is. But it, the thing got built and it's got power. But to be able to reflect on having looked so closely at the design process where things were loose and had not been tightened up at all, and where those that followed Kahn, who it should be said were people who worked closely with Kahn, they had been through it with him many times before, and they needed to tidy some stuff up. And then by tidying things up, they became fixed and were not necessarily, it might have been helpful to have understood that things could be a little bit looser. The grove of trees as you arrive on the site got fixed and tightened up in a way that maybe is not quite right. But for the purposes of that moment in time, they tightened things up as one does in construction process in order to get, the bids, in order to get the project under contract, and then with the anticipation that you will be able to adjust. But there was a whole range of things that were left were not fixed at the end of the design development phase. Kahn was still alive. And there were questions about what was going to happen to the old smallpox hospital just to the north. Because it was owned by different entities. It had a different set of restrictions on it and issues, and they just hadn't had time to work that out. But it was interesting to them, and that whole area may have gotten reconfigured a bit. Instead, it became a rather hard edge, which that happens in design. That's not to say that Kahn wouldn't have to have aligned his decisions to that in the end. But it wasn't fixed at that point. And, a lot of the energy was directed towards things that, affected the go-ahead. The granite and the detailing of the granite was the primary expense in building the thing. The choice of trees and the decision about the surface upon which people walked, you had more time with that. And Kahn was not, had not settled on that. People were pushing him, but it was not a settled matter. It got settled too quickly in the time after his death. But it's also where, there's something that's okay about that, because he's not there. And what can you really do? But do your best. But the Four Freedoms, it animated and pressurized for me in looking at things and in trying to see things, with an awareness of that. And there was literally, people needed information quickly. They needed some background, and they were not entirely, this is the board and the decision makers on the client side. I and a small group of people had kind of inserted ourselves in, and were discreet about, we were not talking outside about what was going on. But I'm not sure, it was a process of gaining their trust. That took time, and that also, blunted to some degree, the impact we had, because they were not ready to hear us from day one. Which is fine. I don't hold that against them, because in the end, there were, we were able to make some positive impacts on the decisions being made to make sure things happened that were, honored or recognized important values that were determining the character of the site. When it was all just still on paper, but it was, just getting drawn out. And that impacted my work moving forward, because I had that as an experience. And while I'm an architect by training, I have a master's of art, I've never worked in an office. I don't have that as an experience. I've worked in offices, but from this point as an archivist, but that's a different sort of position in those spaces. That's an instance where, in a way, I was on the team and working to make it right. So that was.
I mean, it's so fascinating that comes to you. I mean, it's a kind of almost a thing that in a way justifies or turns an archivist into an architect, or there's some kind of such a profound thing in that moment of preserving an idea rather than preserving something
Or
that,
getting to the idea.
or
You know,
getting to the
it's just
idea.
getting to
Yeah.
the, I mean, the preserving, I mean, I get that, but it's also just like getting to the point, getting to the idea,
Mhm.
getting to the sense of the conversation, in order then to be thoughtful about change. You know, I mean, it's not unhelpful to be an architectural archive that's part of a school of design that has a really amazing historic preservation program and has some really thoughtful, engaging people. Um, and you know, these are my colleagues here, and I've done projects with them. And to get the benefit of working on sites from a heritage point of view, doing things like a conservation and management plan or a historic structures report, or things like that, where you come to understand how those charged with maintaining the heritage value of a place in the face of change, which is inevitable, how they go about, you know, being diligent and thoughtful and engaging with the historical record, with what manifests itself in the evidence on the built site, you know, and the building and the change that's occurred there, being thoughtful about the mechanisms for change that have occurred,
Mhm.
um, and not replicating, you know, mechanisms for failure, so to speak. You know, that's all an archive has a place in that conversation, and understanding what animates and is impactful for those conversations, which are not, you know, when those professionals come and they spend a lot of time here, it is a serious building or a landscape that they're working on, because there's not the wherewithal financially and stuff like that to invest a team to spend so much time digging into an archive. But then sometimes there's homeowners that just love their house, and it's not necessarily the most important house or influential house, you know, on the planet, but they love the house, so that they also dig in. So I would come back to that places like this benefit from individuals who know how to navigate them, you know, the keepers of the collections. And that in architectural collections, more often than not, that person is an architect, has trained as an architect. They may never have practiced as an architect, but they've had experience in that. I mean, and the very basic, you know, they know how to read a plan. They know the graphic standards. They know, you know, the process to some degree. That's not unhelpful. And I definitely have colleagues, you know, I'm thinking of Inez Zaluendo up at Harvard. She's an architect. She's in, you know, the structure's a little different up there, but she does the same thing I do. Right. We both gave presentations, and we were just struck by, you know, we were basically saying we do the same sort of thing. And I would just say, how, you know, how can you not do that? Right. How can you not see this from the point of view of the way that an architect would see this as kind of a place that generates new creativity, not preserves it. Right. So that's, you know, I was giving you a getting to the point versus preserving the point. It's more active sort of engagement, and you have to create some structures as a kind of infrastructure that helps people with engagement. Because I don't know if professors teaching design students in studio know how to come into an archive, know what to do when they could be bewildered, and that's okay, right? When they come here, students certainly are. But once you get them in and you put them into a situation where they're literally seeing someone struggling in the same way that we all do in trying to do good work, you know, then you get it. Then people can understand that they can see something of themselves in 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 a collection like this. It might be Louis Kahn's drawings, it might be somebody else's drawings, but you can see Kahn doing something that you understand what he's doing, and that contributes to making something good or trying to make something great. So because you don't want this place to just, I mean, most people, if you ask them what an archive is, it's a storehouse where you put things. You're concerned about making sure that they're safe, they don't get damaged, and so it's really a place where things go to collect dust, and get forgotten. And so, but I think most people who work in archives, challenge that in every way. That's not what these places are for. Otherwise, why save the stuff if it doesn't matter, if it doesn't have a place in the contemporary conversation, and being thoughtful in how one animates that, so that you can show students drawings by someone like Robert Adam, who they would not necessarily have any interest in from a design point of view in the contemporary framework. But you can see him doing things that architects do, and contrasting a drawing he's making in the 18th century with one that an amateur architect was doing, and seeing just the differences in drawing as well as the similarities in drawing, the presence of a scale at the bottom of the drawing, the inclusion of shade and shadow, which is getting that sense of volume and form versus not. So that this is the profession becoming the profession, at least in a European Western sensibility, and how it played out on the surface of paper. And the Robert Adam drawings we have are fun because they're 4 schemes for an unbuilt project. And they, show that the best design was not necessarily what got built. And in fact, it starts to get humorous because the first 2 schemes as presented, he signed his name. The last 2, he's just stopped signing the drawings because he's kind of given up on the job, and ultimately his work is not what's built. So, that might be a reason why the drawings got sold out and left England, because they were like, oh, this isn't an important building. He didn't build it. So it can be funny, it can be lighthearted, but there's serious, moments in that, where you can show how that plays out in the contemporary framework, or at least in, within the past 50, 70 years, a similar sort of instance, where the decisions being made lead things in a direction that maybe is not, not the most exciting. So yeah, no, I mean, there's one of my favorite lines from, Louis Kahn's son, Nathaniel Kahn, did the film My Architect. And, that's a story that's based on a journey. It's a son's journey is the subtitle, as you may remember. And it's kind of the journey to kind of, understand himself, understand his father, and to kind of follow that trajectory. And the first part of it, you're kind of following the son. Well, he visits, the kind of who's who of architects, Philip Johnson and all that. But, he stops and he spends a little time with Frank Gehry. And I think he's in Gary's office, and Gehry says something that's really just perfect, and it's like everybody and everything conspires to suck the juice out of the idea. Your father, Louis Kahn, in other words, did better than most in keeping the juice in the design or in the idea. And, that kind of respect is, at fundamental levels about what you're trying to achieve as a thoughtful designer. You may completely disagree on how Frank Gehry expresses his work, formally, technology, whatever, but he's got heart, and he's got the sense of what you're after, and he can see it in the work. He might do it differently, and that got augmented by, Bob Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. I'm close to them. I got to know them quite well, and Denise is still alive, and I see her quite frequently. And, I'm their archivist. So there's sometimes they would get text messages and emails and Denise would forward, and I've got a folder where I put that stuff. So it was an email from Frank Gehry and he's standing in the National Gallery Sainsbury wing. And he's just like, Bob and Denise standing in your National Gallery in awe of the scope of your vision or just something like that, just, recognizing, as one artist speaking to another or one artist engaging with the work from another, and just, taking the time to recognize just how bloody difficult that is. And so maybe if there's another beat that's behind the kind of thing I'm doing, is just to also recognize and help students, and I think you were touching on this too, is how to get students just to realize, how bloody difficult this all is. And if one is rushing too quickly to a finished idea, you're missing the point. You're missing the opportunity that is maybe essential to elevate, to elevating architecture to something more than just a set of services and products that you provide a client, And so I think, the context in which architects are working today is quite different, I think, than Kahn experienced in his day. And the ability to kind of, think about all the housing that's going up around Philadelphia. And there's always been cheap apartment buildings or, that sort of thing. But the architects doing them and the clients commissioning them 50, 70 years ago, they lived in Philadelphia. They were part of the community. They were connected here and you knew them and they needed to, they could be held to account because they were here. The clients now are kind of invisible. They're investment mechanisms, they're hedge funds, and so it makes the work of doing good work among architects particularly vexing and challenging nowadays. There's more to it, I think, is important.
I guess an important part of that is also a conversation between architects, between practicing architects. And I think the really prominent conversation that you are actually hold in the archive is that conversation between Venturi and Denise Scott Brown and Kahn. And of course, there is that lovely suburb where you sent us, where the conversation is quite literal. They're looking at each other almost, the two houses. But in the archive, there are central cornerstones of the archive in some way. So I wonder, just maybe as we conclude, maybe if you can reflect on that dialogue between Denise Scott Brown and Venturi and Louis Kahn. And maybe I should just throw in the research that originally led me to I guess look at your work, which is the research that I did into Irish architect Shane de Blackham and John Marr. De Blackham and Marr is the name of the practice, where where Shane de Blackham worked for Louis Kahn and John Marr worked for Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. And their practice in some ways is a dialogue between the two, but I guess maybe it would be nice if we can reflect on that dialogue.
Yeah, so, these are people who knew one another, who worked side by side, sat on juries, saw things differently, saw things in similar directions, but they learned from one another, right? So, Lou Kahn and Bob Venturi, one is older than the other. They are equals in many ways. And the flow that goes back and forth between those two architects that precedes Denise coming to America. I'm not excluding her, but there's sparks that are going on there that are equivalent to what Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright and any number of other people that are out there where those dynamics play themselves out as who's the teacher and who's the student, right? It also reflects, and this is where scholars and historians, earn their keep. This is also these larger flows and changes that happen in terms of architecture culture, that reflect global concerns and currents and dynamics, and how an intensification that happens in certain locations for whatever reason, you know, opportunities in building, you know, a dean who knows how to hire young talent, Cuba getting closed down and people fleeing, all of those dynamics play out. So who knows how all of this stuff actually happens, but it happened here in Philadelphia in the time of Kahn, and Kahn was a certain sort of anchor, or a certain sort of center that drew. But those who were here were incredibly talented. So, you know, the conversations that are going on between not just Kahn and Venturi, but Aldo Jurgala, Ian McHarg, the social planners, and Denise certainly fits within that realm. They're thinking about urbanism. They're thinking about the connections that are made through architecture, through planning, through landscape, and information that should be part of the conversation that's maybe been left out. Ecological, you know, concerns, and that the systems that support all life. How could we have not thought about that? So that's, again, you know, takes you back to a collecting mission, and we could be seeking out, you know, top tier star architects from across the globe and bringing somebody in from a far off land. Why not? But on the other hand, there's also this kind of that community sensibility that I was talking about. They may not have seen things the same way, but they were in the same room arguing out possibilities and using their talents in a range of ways. So Aldo Jurgala being someone who's Italian, who worked in Rome, he knows things about working in a place that's got a history. And when you come to Philadelphia, we're a place, you know, among many, you know, of American cities. We have a long history. We have a long history of really great architecture in the city, and a certain sort of sensibilities about progressive ideas. We're a Quaker city, so we can be a little bit more conservative and hesitant. But we're the workshop of the world. We were a place that really understood making things. So there's a great architectural culture here. So that conversation among the designers is important. And then how that gets embodied in those close interpersonal relationships. You know, so Bob and Denise and people who worked with them, the collaborations with Bob and Denise, and recognizing that Denise is an entity on her own. She had a whole history and a whole set of sensibilities that she was cultivating and nurturing and developing in her own way. She starts in conversation with Kahn, you know, with Dave Crane, with a whole host of people, including Bob Venturi, and ultimately they marry and they live their life together, and they do an incredible body of work together. But there's a whole other set of ways, you know, she's got her own experiences that she brings, and to play out those dynamics of how that then provided Bob with another set of concerns about how to look at the pressures and tensions in the modern world, and how architecture can be responsive to that. So no, those things that's what makes a place like this tick. I just hope, and it's, you know, a fundamental hope, that, you know, archives are places that people see as being valuable. They see as being places they want to spend some time in. They want to go to places like this. They see that there is much to be learned from an educational point of view in stopping by here on the way to somewhere else. And that these are places that, you know, are recognized as being significant, valuable, because, you know, everyone needs more support. We need more space. We need more staff. We want to serve higher purposes. But you also get to these pragmatic nuts and bolts. You got to pay to keep the lights on. You got to, you know, do all these sorts of things to keep these places going. You know, but to show that there's inspiration to be had that's a step in the right direction to getting those basics, necessities accounted for. So.
I mean, I guess also because you're there is a school of architecture that you're either supporting or you're a part of. presumably a lot of the culture of the school also is built on the foundations of fragments that are in the archive. So I wonder whether that manifests itself. Is that visible to you? Can you see that kind of historical foundation that maybe sits in the archive? Can you see that manifesting the work or the approach of the school?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you go back into the 50s and 60s, or even further back, in a very basic way, the idea that, drawings can be useful in education. We have some collections that are from the École, and we have a collection that's from the École in Paris from the 1820s. It's from one of the ateliers, and there are drawings that are cut up. They're pasted onto sheets, and they were kept in drawers in the studio in the atelier. And Francois Debray could go out and he could pull things out. They systematized, and you could look at things and bring the drawings into the drafting room, into the studio itself. In the 60s and into the early 70s, students are that's a time where hierarchies are being challenged. You want to think for yourself, and you're challenging the status quo. And in places like Paris and elsewhere, students were protesting, they were revolting against the hierarchies and wanting to see things for themselves. So they were inventing new ways of approaching things that provided multiple ways into the thing. It's not just listening to what such and so says. You have a way of organizing things in your way. So, so this archive, while not established at that moment in time, our foundations are being laid in the 60s. We've got here at Penn no art museum. We have art museums in Philadelphia, but we're one of the, as a major university, not having an art museum is interesting. We have a great archaeological museum, but not art. And so in the 50s and 60s, the question was, well, should we have one? Well, partly it was the students saying, hey, we love, and also to step back for a second, we are a school of fine arts first, and we are still a school of fine arts, even though we've switched from the school of fine arts to design. We still have a fine arts students in our school, and that's different than Yale, different than Harvard, different than Princeton. And so that brings a certain sort of energy. And the art students loved hearing lectures from contemporary artists, but they couldn't see their work in person because they weren't in museums yet. And so creating an Institute of Contemporary Art that allowed a forum or a venue for the cutting edge of art to be in the context of a school, and for students in the community at a university to see that firsthand, because you're seeing things as they happen. And so again, that's part of the foundation that kind of is laid for us. And then people within Kahn's office, because of Kahn's way, almost, this is where it gets bound up with the kind of mystical Kahn, this kind of guru that, kind of is this thinker that speaks in odd ways. That process, that thinking process, and Kahn's way of drawing kind of drags itself out. And the people who started to arrange Kahn's archive before there was any sense of there being an archive were making choices that are still visible today, and that were tipped into scholarly assessment and books early on. And clues were placed in those, locations that tell me I'm on the right track. Partly because I could speak to people involved and they could tell me about, Vincent Scully's book and the story behind that, about the 1968 Venice Biennale and how Carlo Scarpa asked architects to do installations that were around ambiance, and interpreting ambiance. And, Kahn decided the best way of doing that was to lay, about 60 or 70 of his drawings horizontally in one of the rooms at the Biennale, to kind of just reflect on the kind of rawness of creative process. And that's where drawings of the Kimball Art Museum were shown for the first time. And, you know, to see those kind of preferences about how to engage with Kahn's drawings and Kahn's thinking for things other than building, right? So that mystical tone that he takes in his lectures are him asking students to think about things, architectural values that maybe extend outside of just strictly building, you know. So anyway, that is the foundation that's laid here. We're also a school of architecture, you know, or where architecture is taught, where we don't do exhibits, you know, we do kind of, they're kind of ad hoc, but we don't have a steady flow of that because we have this place. But one thing I could say is, having been here for 30 years ago, there were very few tours that came in here. Even 10 years ago, it was like 20, 25 groups would pass through in that academic year. So saying that this year we're crossing 140, that's a lot, right? It's too much. It's too much, but it's exactly right, because that's where this is a place that's coming into its own. And it's a resource that all of our architecture students, all of our landscape students engage with several times.
And why do you think that is, Bill? Why do you think is
it
that?
just built up ways in which, particularly in their first year, the students are over here, and for one session or two sessions of their classes, they're engaging with the material that's here with a specific moment of a specific class in mind. And it opens things up for them. It gives them a different set of experiences.
I mean, why is there so much external interest suddenly? Do you think it's Kahn's becoming really a cult figure, or?
No, I think it's honestly, it's because when people are here, we use Kahn's materials, but we're not talking specifically about Kahn so much as we are talking about thoughtful making, which is something Kahn valued very much. And that ability to contrast what Kahn is doing with what others are doing.
Yes.
So I think that there's, maybe broadly understood, a value in reflecting on creative process using the analog tools associated with Kahn's lifetime. Not putting aside digital, because I think with Venturi, we start to get into digital, and it's interesting to see how he relates to digital. And it's important to see that the possibilities that manifest themselves in developing his ideas with the coming of the digital, and it's young people in the office who are bringing that. But then it's the approach is shaped by Bob or Denise's impulses, their interests in that. So I mean, Kahn is helpful, and Kahn is a force that brings certain people here time and again. But there's groups that come from schools like Keene University in New Jersey, and we've seen them for about 15 years, and it's students in their undergraduates, they're 19 years old, maybe 20, and they're in their first year or first semester of design, and the faculty there just see a value in having them come here and just being exposed to drawing, and that there's a place where they can walk in a room where there's these two big tables, and they can enter a world that is utterly different than what they've seen before, and they can take that experience with them into the rest of the semester, into the rest of their education, and that there's a value in that. So
absolutely. I mean, the students that came to see the space and the tables, my students that came were really impacted by it. I mean, I can really see it in what they're doing now. So it's really amazing.
no, I mean, I think for me, it's understanding that those students and being able to connect with those students is the most critical thing that we do in focusing on what we're trying to achieve. And what's interesting for them, or What are they struggling with? They're not struggling with a lack of knowledge about Louis Kahn. There's
Yes,
plenty of
exactly.
information
That's
where you
very
can go
true.
get that. And in fact, some of them were like, I don't, they're interested in other architects, and why not? But architects being thoughtful about what they do and in how they go about doing it, and leaving a paper trail, leaving models behind, you can bring that to life. And it's just a great stimulant and a reminder of pathways that others have taken in the past. And the terrain is changing, the landscape is different, the circumstances are always in flux. You cannot follow the same path. There's no possibility of that. But you can recognize that when all is said and done, I think those, artists or people within architecture that there's a vertical dimension, that's aspiration, that's elevating, uplifting, in design. It's not just this horizontal of kind of covering all the bases. There's something more to it. And how you get there is so kind of key. And just, that's a very basic thing that I don't know if that's ever uttered in architecture schools, because it's just like maybe so obvious, but it's also just like, if you say, you almost sound like you're being stupid, because like, but
No, it's really important. It's
what it comes
key.
down to when all is said and done.
Yeah.
And so I feel, in having worked in a collection like this as long as I have, and recognizing across all these collections, this is what everyone's trying to do. This is there's no question that that's what they're seeking out to do. They don't always get there. The circumstances don't always allow that, but they have resiliency, and they have strength, and they have ability, and they have, the desire, more creativity, apply more. How do I do that? And that's going to make the world. I mean, I have the confidence that will make the world a better place. Because it has proved itself time and again in visiting those specific locations that is an activity that is generative of stuff, and that's what we do. Because I think it's important to connect with more archives. And
I think having key figures like Kahn and Venturi is actually quite good for the archive, because it opens up, right? It's a reason why people go there, but then hopefully you discover more.
Well, Avery's collection is pretty darn good too.
Okay. So something to
they do have Frank Lloyd Wright, which is pretty great. And they also have some Louis Sullivan. I would love to have a drawing or two by Louis Sullivan. We were able to get a drawing by Charles Rennie Mackintosh, a few years back. And that brings, that means you can bring a drawing by Mackintosh onto the same table as Kahn and others. It animates things. So we're fortunate that we've got some resources that allow us to do that every once in a while. We're not trying to collect in depth about Mackintosh, but someone like that choosing to do
establishing that conversation, as you say.
Right. And just, knowing what they're doing, and the choices they make after doing a great job, at the Glasgow School of Art, and then just taking time off and just taking 9 months to go off into the English countryside and to draw plants. That's pretty badass.
That's really good.
And then how one makes those drawings. It's just, it's delightful to have that layer that one.
So what did you acquire? You acquired some?
Just one drawing of, it's the equivalent of an architect's travel sketch.
Okay.
He's drawing a plant, a humble little plant, that one finds along the English, coast. And just beautifully drawn in the way that, the watercolor is applied, but then there's also areas that are not watercolored. So, you automatically see he's stepping into a sense of abstraction, even though he's drawing in situ, in plein air. But the thing that really blows me away, and there's maybe about 60 or 70 drawings that survive from this period. He signs his drawings, but then his initials are there, but then there's the initials of other people. And he's included their initials not because they've made the drawing, but because they're there with him.
Oh, wow.
Right.
Okay.
So it's his wife, it's friends, maybe they're having a picnic. They're just sitting out in the landscape, enjoying the sun, and he's making a drawing. He's not drawing them, but he's captured their presence. So it's, you start to get into the choices of what to include, what not to include in making a drawing, which is also just like an essential sort of thing. You've got to decide what the important thing is. And, getting back to that human impulse, that human sense of that community that's with you, on that journey, and having that sense of a register of those people, who are there. That's important to me. I mean, just in thinking about the work that people like Bob and Denise and Louis Kahn and others do, they are in a space and there are others in that room. And for me, I think my interest is in being able to move through that space creatively. And, as someone who's been able to work at a collection like this for as long as I have, and to talk to the people who were in the room, to have the luxury, or have the privilege rather, of having all of that information and then having it in your head, and then to go look at drawings. You've got this spatial register of that's part of the good stuff that you do in contextualizing an object, in curatorial practice and historical understanding. But it also is like, it's the room where it happens, and that you can start to see individuals who are usually not the people who are talked about, within that realm. And that's good stuff.
In the way that you just described this creation of space, it just made me think that in many ways, you are the archive as well. Do you ever think of yourself as the archive? I mean, of course, you're a finite creature. You're going to one day not be the archive, but in so many ways, you are also an archive.
Well, it's the activation of these memories that it's things, I mean, there's a kind of collecting that I do that goes into these little notebooks.
Okay.
And this is 104. And, I think I have notes from the other day. We were with Denise Scott Brown, and, and we were talking, and there were ideas going back and forth across the table. And I needed a vessel, a vehicle that I would be able to capture this in the moment as it was hitting my ear. And the words and how they came across are present, and that I could note the people that were in the room. Because, I'm 55 now. 20, 30 years ago, I could remember everything. I was never going to forget the things I heard. But then you realize your mind, or my mind, was already changing them. They were modifying themselves in time.
Which is also fine, because
I think it's totally legit. It's totally legit, because that's the creative.
Exactly.
Because it's like, it's not enough to just copy the past, right? The best people, they never get stuck in that. But to recognize that there's so much energy that's built up in that, and that building on that is a worthy thing. The stories I have and the knowledge I have, there's others like me out there, and often those are the people that you remember being important teachers, and that I value the presence that I have as a role as a teacher that's at the school, and I don't have to give grades. I don't have to. I'm not a part of that higher, that system, per se. And so, but that's part of the value of a collection. And so for me, someone who's been here this long, I am concerned about how you continue to build on that, where it's not just contingent on a single individual. That's not sustainable in the long run. And, we've done a lot to build up the engagement and use of this collection, and that will help, move things forward into the future, but it can't be only one person. So, we're doing like the practical things of, I have, a really great archivist who is a head archivist, and that we're these are things institutions do every once in a while, is you restructure your staff, and that you make the archivist someone who has more responsibility, and that in order to make the collections visible, you do things like digitizing your finding aids, and you put them in places where people look for things now. People look for things in ways that are different now than they were 25, 30 years ago. And they don't see things now because they don't know how to look for things in the way that I was introduced to it. And so that is a way of transferring the knowledge that I have. But also, I'm satisfied in many ways that, if I've, captured someone's imagination, if I've given them some tools, I've done my work. That's enough. And that somebody else will come in after me and they will do it differently. But I think this fundamental idea of loosely putting things onto a table, and layering things on top of each other, it might seem haphazard, but there's a lot of intention behind it. That looseness is important, because there's lots of ways that you allow people entry into that. And so that kind of culture, that ethos, I think is important. And building the connections between certain groups of people, the students, not just at this architecture school, but any architecture school, any school for that matter, I think is very important. And then recognizing that larger public engagement always has a way of feeding back, because it elevates it to to put it in Kahn's terms, he liked to imagine the little old lady from Abilene, Texas, walking into the Kimball Art Museum, and someone who maybe had not been exposed to architecture at the level that the Kimball Art Museum achieves, but she gets it, right? You can't forget those people. You can't forget that that's ultimately maybe the most important thing. So from the point of view of the archive, also returning to those as audience is a way to kind of be able to connect architects with the value of remembering, or of being thoughtful about someone who's going to be walking into those buildings and maybe does not know, one particular gauge of stainless steel from another, one particular method of finish over another, but knows the impact through just feeling something, So, yep, this is what I do every day.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah.
Please continue to do that. And
Okay.
I mean, I think in a way, this channel is an archive. So I think this is also going to be part of that legacy in a way. So it's going to be there for a long time.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Now, looking through the people that you've touched on and the kind of journey, and watching a bit of Turner Brooks and going for a drive with Turner Brooks, that was pretty great. So
That was quite special.
yeah. And there's things like, I remember memories that have stuck with me from years back. The architect from Alabama, Sam Mockbee, who was he was doing what was the rural studio. And he died young. I mean, he died, maybe only a year or two after he visited, and he came to give a lecture at the school, and he came and hung out in the archives for a little bit, and he wanted to look at all the old Beaux-Arts renderings. Okay. And it was, here's someone who's serving the rural poor and creating very inventive ways in order to affect positive change and engagement in the daily lives of people in places that architects often overlook. Here's someone who could find mental stimulation in looking at a watercolor and wash rendering done by someone like Paul Cray, and just asking myself, what the hell are you doing here? And why is this interesting? I don't think I remember precisely what, but I could see it in his eyes. I could see it in just the kind of energy, that maybe was going back to something, that recharging, that, just, these are things that stick in the back of your mind that maybe you cannot